Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. We really appreciate you being here. We have a very interesting topic for you today, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, Proficiency with Comprehensible Input and Clear Feedback, Adapting Instruction in Real Time to Meet Students' Needs. And we have our fantastic Diego Hera with us tonight. Diego is a passionate Spanish teacher and renowned presenter in language learning. With extensive experience in both Colombia and the United States, he brings a fresh cultural perspective to teaching Spanish. Diego's teaching strategies cater to all proficiency levels. He co-founded the hashtag LangChat and hashtag CharlaL on Twitter, supporting language educators worldwide. Thank you very much for being with us, Diego.
Thank you very much, Sabrina, for the introductions, and welcome everyone. So, as Sabrina mentioned, we're going to talk about proficiency with comprehensible input and about clear feedback. And I believe this is a very important topic because sometimes when we talk about comprehensible input, we understand the idea, but it is kind of a little blurry when we think about how do we assess when we teach with comprehensible input. And that's one of the main goals of this webinar today. So thank you very much for those participants. I see that there are people from many different places here. Arizona, Boston, New York, Puerto Rico, New Hampshire, Los Angeles, Texas, Georgia, Oklahoma, New Jersey, Ohio, Maryland, Boston, Tennessee. Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here. And let's start with this webinar, Adapting Instruction in Real Time to Meet Students' Needs. So, the very first thing is, what are we going to see in this webinar? First of all, we're going to talk about comprehensible input. It is very important to make sure that we approach this topic the right way, because sometimes we believe that comprehensible input is just a set of activities, and people talks about comprehensible input thinking that an activity like movie talk, that's comprehensible input. Of course, it's one of the ways to give comprehensible input, but it's not comprehensible input at large. We're going to talk about principles of CI. We're going to explain the principles of CI. Where does it stand in theory? We're going to talk about practical strategies for integrating comprehensible input into language instruction, very clear strategies and activities that we can do in our classroom. And we're going to talk about effective feedback strategies and assessment methods tailored to language learning goals and objectives. Throughout the webinar, I'm going to be making the match with the Reporteros program from Clyde World Languages to see how the Reporteros program aligns with comprehensible input and the principles of comprehensible input and what we're going to be presenting today. So here we go. We're going to also talk about incorporating frequent checks for understanding. All right, so let's get started. First, comprehensible input. So the principles of comprehensible input. So no one better to explain what comprehensible input is than Dr. Stephen Krashen. As we know, Dr. Stephen Krashen is the person who has researched and has worked the most on the idea of comprehensible input. He came up with the term comprehensible input. And that's very important to know because I have heard from other people that comprehensible input was therapy for Stephen Krashen? Maybe some practices that, align with comprehensible input were there before Dr. Krashen. I understand that. But the term comprehensible input, it's we owe that to Dr. Stephen Krashen. And that needs to be very clear. So I have a short video here. I'm gonna show you about 4 minutes of this video where Dr. Krashen explains a little bit not just about what comprehensible input is, but also he refers to how the different ways that we have been teaching languages have not been that successful, and why comprehensible input is the only way to teach languages. When he presented this, I'm assuming it's probably during the 80s, the early 90s. Many people will laugh when he said things like comprehensible input is the only way to teach languages. People will laugh when he says things like we all acquire languages the same way, because people were so used to hearing totally different things from different outlets. So let's hear a little bit from Dr. Krashen.
To begin my presentation this afternoon by talking about what I think is the most important issue in language education, the most important question, and that is, how do we acquire language? And I'd like to begin this discussion, this presentation, with an outrageous statement. In my opinion, we all acquire language the same way. The reason this is an outrageous thing to say is that these days in education, we're living in an age of individual variation. We're very concerned about how our students are different, not how our students are the same. Those who've been around in the field for a while remember, about 15, 20 years ago, people were very concerned about something called field-dependent learners and field-independent learners. You give people a certain test and one group gets this treatment, one group gets the other. Then about 15 years ago, it was left side of the brain, right side of the brain. Some people are left hemisphere thinkers, some people are right hemisphere. Then about 10 years ago, cognitive style. The cognitive style of the home culture differs from the cognitive style of the school culture. We have a clash, etc. Well, each of the examples I gave you is probably correct. There is individual variation, and there is quite a bit of it. Nevertheless, there are some things we all do the same. Let me give you some examples.
There are some things that we all do the same. He's going to give some examples, but let's reflect on our instruction. And let's reflect on what we are asked by our administration. Most of the times, administration likes to talk about differentiation. They still want to talk about left brain, right brain. They want to talk about multiple intelligences. They want to talk about learning styles, kind of like trying to find a place for each student. But Dr. Krashen says, hey, we all acquire languages the same way. If we want to see how this reflects to our instruction, maybe we can think, we can teach in a way that involves everyone. And we can make these groups get interested about languages if we teach to a community instead of a classroom. And that's why it's so important to create a community in a language classroom. When you have a community, you have a group of individuals with the same purpose. So that's what we want to see, okay? And taking into account that we all learn the same way, we all acquire, not learn, languages the same way. Let's see what he keeps saying.
Digestion. We all digest food the same, no significant individual variation. First you put it in your mouth, then you chew it up, then it goes down your throat, then into your stomach. That's how it's done everywhere. That's how it's done in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa. That's how it's done everywhere in the world. The visual system's the same everywhere. It's always the occipital lobe in the back of the brain. It's never in the side of the brain. It's never in the front of the brain. It's never in the elbow. It's done exactly the same everywhere you go. By the way, I used to use sex as an example of things everyone does the same, but some counterexamples have been pointed out to me recently. Actually, I saw this movie, if you really want to know the truth. Anyway, we all acquire language the same, and rather than just talk about it, I'd like to show you. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes and give you some sample language lessons. I'll use a language that I'm sure you've heard before and maybe some of you speak, and you can tell me which of these two very brief lessons you like better. Here's lesson number 1. Wir werden jetzt anfangen, Deutsch zu lernen. Und ich möchte im Voraus sagen, dass nach meiner Meinung Deutsch ist eine sehr schöne Sprache. Und ich hoffe, dass Sie alle sehr viel Erfolg mit Deutsch haben werden. What do you think? Good lesson so far? Do you think if I kept talking to you like that, you'd pick up German? Not very likely. How about if I repeated it? Would that help? Probably not.
This moment when he starts saying, do you think if I repeat it? Do you think if I speak louder? Do you think if I... In the back, he is referring to the different language teaching methods from the past. So he's being a little sarcastic here.
How about if I said it louder? Would that help? Probably not. How about if I said it and you repeated it back? Again, I don't think that would help. How about if I wrote it out for you and you could see it on your television screen? That wouldn't help either. How about if I wrote it out for you and you copied it down? How about if I wrote it out for you and deleted every 5th word and you tried to guess what the word is?
Okay, so how many of those things that he's saying do we still do in our classes? Let's think.
The truth is that none of these things help. None of these things mean anything, and I hope you can see that now. Here's lesson number 2. And for this, you have to watch me carefully. Das ist meine Hand. Verstehen Sie das? Hand? Everyone say, ja, I can hear you, even though it's a TV audience. Good. Kopf. Das ist mein Kopf. Verstehen Sie Kopf? Ja? Gut. Kopf. And here I'll draw a picture now. Kopf. Ist gut, ja? Schön. Kopf. Das ist Mr. Spock, ja? Mr. Spock hat 2 Ohren. Ohren. Verstehen Sie Ohren? Er hat 2 Ohren. Okay, Mr. Spock. Ja? Ach, nein. Entschuldigung. Okay. Augen. Verstehen Sie Augen? Augen. Wie viele Augen? 1, 2, 3 Augen. 3 Augen. Ist das richtig? 3 Augen? Nein. Wir haben nur 2 Augen. Mund. Verstehen Sie Mund? Und hier ist eine Zigarette, ja? Nein. Zigaretten sind nicht gut. If you understood lesson number 2, not every word, but more or less, I did everything necessary to teach you German.
I did everything necessary to teach you German, which takes us to the idea of we are not teachers. We are facilitators of language. When we facilitate, we make language acquisition easy through different avenues. So we're not teaching. I know it's so nice to be called a teacher. You teach me. But our role has to be more the role of the facilitator. How can I facilitate language acquisition to my students? What he just did was facilitating German to us.
And now I'm going to share with you the most important thing I have learned about language. Probably the best kept secret in the profession. We acquire language in one way and only one way. When we understand messages. We call this...
When we understand messages. This is very important because let's think about a class, a language class that is based on grammar instruction. When you write a conjugation, I am, you are, he is, she is, we are, you are, they are, what are you communicating? What is the message there? And then the students have to memorize such conjugation and probably try to use it in incomplete sentences, sentences with a blank, to show understanding. And that has been the game for years and years and years. But Dr. Krashen talks about the essential part of language learning, which is message. If there's no message, there is no communication. If there's no communication, why even use the language? What is the purpose of learning a language if there is no communication?
Comprehensible input. We acquire language when we understand what people tell us, not how they say it, but what they say, or when we understand what we read.
Okay, so he introduced at that moment the term of comprehensible input. And we understand language when we use it. We understand language not when we know about that language. It's not a class about Spanish. It's not a class about German or Italian or French. It's a class where we actually use.
To begin my presentation this afternoon by talking about what I think is cognitive.
Sorry. Okay, I'm gonna keep going, keep moving. So it is very important to remember the significance of comprehensible input in facilitating language acquisition. As we saw on the video, when we use ways to make things understandable, meaning when we allow or we give comprehensible input, the acquisition happens in the student's brain. Why? It's as simple as this. We only acquire to our lives the things that we understand or the things that we are familiar with. When you go to a place that you're not used to, some unfamiliar place, it takes a while to get used to it because it's totally different. So you need to understand first the context in order to acquire it. So comprehensible input allows us to do that. So what is comprehensible input? Comprehensible input refers to language that an input that is understandable to learners, even if it contains elements that they haven't learned yet. And that's the cool thing, because we thought that comprehensible input was only given language that was comprehensible to the students. But if we only do that, the students are going to stay at a very, low level. But if we give comprehensible input and we give a little more than what they understand, but they are able to understand the new things through context of that comprehensible input that we gave at the beginning, that's when the proficiency starts, going up. So I do remember that when we started talking about CI readers, kind of like short stories or short novels, written especially for second language instruction, a lot of those stories were very repetitive, and they didn't really include an element that will go a little above, the student's proficiency level. So if the novel was written for novice mid, it stayed there, novice mid, novice mid, novice mid. I'm not gonna say the titles of those books because that's not the idea, but that's what was going on. So suddenly we start seeing a little decline on the quality of reading in world language instruction. Probably many of you who took Spanish or a second language in college or even in high school had to read books that were not specifically written for your proficiency level. You probably had to read books that were written for native speakers. And that was hard, really. And you probably had to use the dictionary many times. Well, that's the other extreme, see? But we don't want the very simple kind of reading where our students just keep their proficiency level. And we don't want the book written specifically for native speakers that, yeah, it's going to challenge you, but it's going to frustrate you more. We want something in the middle. And I believe that now these days, editorial companies such as Clade World Languages are thinking about that. And that's why the readers that are supporting some of the programs like Reporteros, they have little novels. Think about that. How can I help the student to improve their proficiency level? Okay, so always giving a little more. When we use comprehensible input, we are providing learners with meaningful exposure to language. Meaningful, meaning it has a meaning. They understand. If I don't understand, there's not meaning for me. And that can be applied in any, field of life. So it provides learners with meaningful exposure of language. So the principles of comprehensible input, the I+1 principle, again, presenting material just above the learner's current level. Dr. Krashen never say, let's just keep the same level always. Scaffolding, providing support and guidance as learners develop their language skills. Scaffolding is just to be attentive to make sure that we are doing this in a progression, in a progressive way. And it doesn't matter the level that you're teaching. It doesn't matter if it's level 1 or AP level. You always have to scaffold in order to be honestly giving comprehensible input. Taking into account the context, that language input, it's more understandable with a context that the students can recognize. And also the repetition. I don't want to say repetition, but these are the original words used in the theory. I like to use the use of language. We reinforce language through the use of the language. It doesn't matter if they make mistakes, okay? So we talk about language structures and vocabulary. As long as we're using it, that is allowing for some comprehensible input. So the I+1 principle, again, the language input should be slightly beyond the learner's current level. So that way we can challenge them to progress. The importance of this is that the input, when it gets to the right level of difficulty, not too much, that actually motivates the student to keep learning, to keep acquiring the language because they feel that they can express more with the different times. So we have an example here of the program Reporteros by Clade World Languages with a text that is very well written. If we think about the comprehensible input aspects that we were explaining before. So we have the right kind of words in Spanish, and I'm using the Spanish examples because this is what I use, but there's reporteros for French classes as well that uses the same approach. And you see that they are trying to facilitate understanding through the pictures, which is quite important. Many people ask about, is there a text that is comprehensible input? I believe that at this point, the Reportero series is probably the only text that has gone way beyond, trying to incorporate these principles of comprehensible input to make the textbook also comprehensible to the students. Okay, so scaffolding, it's such an important part of this comprehensible input road, because when we do things in a progressive way, all the students feel supported. It's not that we're going to have some materials catered to the advanced students and some materials catered to the less advanced students in the same classroom. No, we're going to start from here and we're going to start building. And the students can see that progress. And we can have students who are in the base, students who are in the middle, or students who are on the top of that building that we're trying to build with language. So they get there at the right moment, but still they feel that they are part of a group that has the same goals for language acquisition. So there are some scaffolding techniques, such as breaking tasks into manageable steps or providing visual aids, as I just showed you in the example from the Reporteros series. Here, again, so we talk about scaffolding, we talk about visuals, we talk about here some questioning that are based on this text, and we also present here different pictures. All of these elements, pictures, questions, maybe a little activity here, a little activity there, plus these visuals are supporting this text. So the intention is to help the student to understand this. I teach full-time and I have to use a textbook, and I usually just found the reading and a bunch of questions. That's it. But there's no support for the student to actually understand in a different way that text to make it meaningful. And that's a problem, because a textbook should not just be a book with a bunch of information and a bunch of rules that we're going to be using in the class and for homework. The textbook should be a book that actually helps students when they open it by themselves at home. Meaning the textbook should be also a language facilitator. It's not just information. It's not just practice. The textbook should be the facilitator. And that's what I love about the Reporteros series, that I see this series as facilitators, meaning they support our job in the classroom. The context is probably the most important part here, because when we contextualize language, this helps students making connections. So we work, probably most of you work with teenagers, right? So what is the context that teenagers appreciate? Is it just talking about their favorite band, or talking about their favorite food, or their favorite whatever? Probably not. You know, the best way to connect and contextualize things with teenagers is through the life experiences. So what are the life experiences? Simple: school, friends, classes, extracurricular activities, just, and sometimes family. Just in those 4 or 5 topics, you can contextualize anything. You can talk about any, for example, of the AP topics, contextualizing to any of those topics. We don't have to go that far. This is kind of like what I tell the teachers when I talk about songs and music in the classroom. Sometimes we're so concerned to bring music. I don't even know the names of these singers. There's one, no, I forgot, but just the music that they listen, okay? And we're so concerned to bring that because that's what they like, and probably that's gonna make them connect more to the class. And I tell the teachers, you know what? You can bring whatever. You can bring boleros, you can bring bachata, you can bring rancheras, you can bring música para planchar, whatever you want, as long as you like it, and as long it has meaning to the teacher. That music is meaningful to the teacher, because then you're going to be able to provide context. Providing context should not be that challenging. We should be providing context in a very natural and familiar way. And the more natural we do it through our experiences, sharing with the students, the more they connect and the more language acquisition happens in an easier way. Okay? All right, my friends. So when we talk about context and when we talk about the student's life and I talk about friends and I talk about family, well, a way for them to connect with friends and to connect with family is through social media. And of course, the importance of their phones. And this is something that I also appreciate a lot about the Reportero series because they think, okay, what is the language that our students are using to connect with reality? So you have activities here like La Vida en el Celular. And then we can talk about many things. I was just reading an article about how in the United States, for those who are outside of the United States, maybe in Jamaica, how parents are just texting kids during class because we have lost the battle of the cell phones and now we tell the kids, okay, just leave it on your desk. As long as you're not gonna look at it, it's okay, honey, you can leave it there, right? Because many schools lost that battle. And then parents know that the kids have the cell phone there and the parents are the ones texting in the middle of the class. So what is going on? But these are good debates. These are good conversations with our students that Reporteros also allows us to do. All right, my friends, the repetition or using the language, exposing the student to the language. Look, we still insist in having speaking assessments. We love to divide this into written assessment, speaking assessment, and listening assessment. And we feel like, yeah, that's what we need to do. And my question is, why? Why speaking assessment? Is this the only moment that you're gonna hear your students talking that you have to do a speaking assessment? Why don't you speak the whole time in class so you know where each one of them is in the speaking skill? And obviously with that comes the listening. So to me, I have to do speaking assessments. This is what I have to do at my school, right? So I sit down in front of the students and they look at me and they kind of laugh, you know? And I'm like, okay, this is a speaking assessment, be serious, okay? And they kind of laugh. And we just have conversations like the same ones we have every day in the classroom. So what happens when we rely on speaking assessments? What that's showing is that we're not giving enough exposure to the language to our students. We're just giving little bits and pieces here and there. And therefore, we have to uh, schedule a speaking assessment to see if they got something out of whatever we're giving them in class. But I'm not going to go too far from here. But what I'm trying to say is that that use of the language in the classroom is quite important. And what do our students want with language? They want to speak. They want to be able to talk to someone who speaks that language in a native way, right? So a lot of the time that we spend in the class should be used speaking and listening, exposing them to the language. We kind of like get a little concerned when our students mispronounce words and they keep mispronouncing, for example, hotel instead of hotel. What is that showing? That the only thing that that's showing is that the students have not been enough exposed to the language to make that connection in their brain. It doesn't matter if we remind them every day, hey, you don't say hotel, you say hotel in Espanol. That doesn't matter. The next day, they're going to make the same mistake because it was just a little activity in the class where we use that word, not constant exposure. Okay? So let's incorporate repetition or language use into our lessons. We can do this through different ways. I'm not saying that you have to stand up in front of your students the whole class and talk to them the whole class. You can do it through games. You can do it through chants or songs. And music is quite important for this, okay? So when we talk about repetition, we also talk about how do we organize the questions for students. are the questions, what are the questions in a language class looking for? I believe that if we only look for information from the text, we are just probably, getting 50% of what we should get. I believe that questioning in the word language classroom should be more a tool, a formative tool that will help us approach the text in many different ways. Meaning we should have 5 questions for the same answer, but 5 different type of questions. That's what is going to enrich the student. And somehow that is also, we're providing repetition and we're providing use of the language in a different way, in a written way. But if each question only looks for one specific answer, then we're not practicing the language. What we're doing here is just looking for the right answer, the content. All right, my friends. So practical strategies for integrating comprehensible input into our language instruction. So this is it, the first one. So we talk about visual aids. And as Dr. Krashen very well showed us, the visual aids are key. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be Picasso, that we have to be such artists in order to be able to give visual aids. A visual aid is simply pointing at something in the classroom related to what you're talking. That's a visual aid. Okay, pictures, diagrams, videos. These provide context and support for the students to understand the vocabulary. And that's when we can then have our class 90% of the target language. Why? Because we don't have to translate everything that we say to our students or the new vocab. We are showing, we're making it visual and pointing at that thing that you're referring to, la manzana, see? And that really helps with the problem that we have sometimes that we're translating everything and we cannot keep the class 90% in the target language. Now, bring realia. So real life objects, but this is very interesting because we think that realia is to bring a box of cereal, for example. We think that realia is to bring a sombrero in the Spanish class, or we think that realia is to bring food from the country where the target language is used. But you know what? Why do we have to look so far? Realia comes from the word real. And what is something real that you have in front of you? Yes, your students. You don't even have to bring realia to the classroom. You just need to work with what you have in front of you. You have kids wearing different colors. You have kids using different types of pens. Do you have kids with different types of backpacks, different types of phones? They look different from each other. Okay, remember context, and now we talk about realia. When we use what we have in front of us and ourselves, it's more meaningful to the student instead of just bringing objects that from the target culture. See, so let's rethink a little bit the concept of realia. More practical strategies for integrating comprehensible input into our language instruction. Storytelling. Oh, my friends, storytelling. You know what? Maria Acaso, she's an amazing teacher in Spain. She's an art teacher, but she reflects on education, modern education. And she says in one of her books, students now these days, they don't want classes that bring them information that is disconnected. Okay, today we're going to talk about the present tense. 1 week later, today we're going to talk about the preterite tense. 1 week later. Today, we're going to talk about the imperfect tense. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but it's like we focus on chunks, specific chunks of information. And Maria says, now these days, young people likes narration. That's why the success of things like Netflix, and not just Netflix, but the success now these days of series. So it's not just watching the movie now. The kids want the series. They want 50 episodes, 60 episodes, and season 1, season 2, season 3. Everything has to be connected. And there is no better way to connect things and provide comprehensible input than through storytelling. Storytelling allows us to create a world that is connecting everything. And the same thing happens with reading. There are curriculums based only on reading. You go to some very progressive schools and you ask them, what is your curriculum for level 2 Spanish? And they would tell you, we have 4 books. We read 4 books the whole year. What textbooks? No, we read 4 novels. See, our teachers contextualize and work with those novels in order to provide and facilitate language that results in acquisition. Why? Because it's the narration, okay? Another strategy, modeling. Demonstrate language used through modeling conversations, dialogues, or scenarios. So as teachers, it's not us always given, the directions, this and that, but modeling. And there's no modeling that is more successful than modeling with students in the classroom. Sometimes with high-level students, students with higher proficiency, sometimes with students with less proficiency, but modeling constantly with them. And when you interact with your students on a regular basis, that's modeling. It doesn't have to be in front of the class. You're modeling constantly. But for that, we need to be connected to the students and we need to interact with them instead of just waiting on the desk for them to do an activity or something like that. So we have more practical strategies. Contextualize activities. Design activities that require students to use language in meaningful contexts, such as role plays, simulations, or problem-solving tasks. So role plays, quite important. Allow them to act, allow them to use some drama. It is a very well-proven strategy. Structure input. So structure input is breaking down complex language into input that is smaller, more manageable chunks. One idea is that if you have a reading that can be a little complex, you can, and I know this takes time, but you can make chunks of that reading. You can do it, divide each sentences into 2 parts, or just sentences, just the sentences, but not connected into one paragraph or one entire article, but just the sentences. Allow the students to read just the sentences. It's amazing how they understand better that way because you're chunking. There is a tool online that is called Textivate that allows us to divide reading in that way, Textivate. So here, we talk about interpersonal speaking, we talk about role-playing. So this is an activity of role-playing proposed by the Reporteros series. I believe this is in Reporteros 1. So it says interpersonal speaking. Imagine que estás visitando un mercado en Lima y tienes sed. So imagine that you're visiting a market in Lima and that you feel thirsty. Elige 3 frutas o verduras para el jugo que vas a tomar. So choose 3 fruits or veggies for the juice that you're going to drink. En parejas, representen la conversación entre el cliente y el vendedor. So represent the conversation between the client and the salesperson. And you have to record the conversation. And then it says estrategias, make it real. Try to make your conversation as natural as possible. Think of different things you can say. Say hello, wish a good day, explain what you want, taste, think. This is key. I have not seen this type of strategies these really strategies that connect with language acquisition in other series. Make it real. It's so easy to say, but so difficult to forget, to remember, including this in textbooks, but these guys got the right idea. All right, so more strategies. Language-rich environment. So remember, an environment that is displaying vocabulary, phrases, and sentences that encourage students to use the target's language in various contexts. Meaning, let's use a variety of vocabulary when we're interacting with them. That's the only way they're gonna grow on their vocabulary. Interactive learning, foster interactive learning experiences through group discussions, pair work, collaborative projects, allowing students to engage with language input and practice communication skills. And I want to focus here on collaborative projects because how often do we suggest our students to work in projects? I believe that we do this once a quarter, meaning that they're going to have 4 projects in a school year. That's very little. That's very little because that doesn't really foster pair work and collaborative work among the students. So there are some projects here in the Reporteros series. There are some expressions in Spanish because Reporteros is a Spanish program that allows for enriching the vocabulary of the students. So not just the typical hola, ¿cómo estás? Muy bien, gracias. Y tú, muy bien, yo. But things like, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? ¿Sí? Saying goodbye like hasta luego, hasta pronto. 2 weeks ago, a student came to my classroom and when he left, he said, gracias, señor. And I say, con mucho gusto. He looked at me like, what? You know, honestly, I probably have never used con mucho gusto because they're so used to the de nada, or está bien, or no pasa nada. But we need to enrich that vocabulary because especially if these students are going to be taking an AP kind of class, they want AP program, the students using vocabulary that is cultural and that is showing that they actually know more about the target cultures. And this is a project. The Reporteros series is full of mini projectos. Constantly, they're giving you mini projectos that you can work, not just 4 times throughout the year, but these are mini projectos that allow you to give to your students, and they're not going to take that long as the big projects that we usually give to our students. Okay, so more practical strategies, feedback and clarification. It's important to give feedback, timely feedback to the students in order to address misunderstandings or gaps in comprehension. Also, utilize gestures and body language. I believe that's one of the most powerful techniques that we can use among with the visuals, but we have our body. Let's just move. Let's use our body to make things comprehensible to our students. And also, we can use graphic organizers because they give a different perspective of the information or the topic that we're discussing with our students. And that also allows them to use those skills to interpret different graphics. Integrated skills approach. Adopt an integrated skills approach that combines listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So not just focusing on one thing, that something that focuses on all the skills. For example, here on Reporteros, we have a lesson that incorporates all those skills: listening, writing, reading, speaking. In 2 pages, you have everything. So this is referring to integrated skills approach. So we can say that in the Reportero series, there is an integrated skill approach for our students. Okay? All right, effective feedback strategies and assessment methods tailored to language learning goals and objectives. So, effective feedback, error correction with context. So we provide feedback with context in meaningful communication. So we are not going to be correcting our students in the use of or misuse of a conjugation, for example. We're going to put everything in context because that's in a more holistic way. They're going to pay more attention and they're going to see that if they make a mistake, that impedes communication. But sometimes there are mistakes of conjugation that really doesn't impede communication because you have an idea of the verb that you have in mind. Recast. Recast student errors by rephrasing them in correct language. Recast is a strategy that is very common, but sometimes we forget to do it. So by giving students the right way to say things, we're providing them with right input as well. We talk about self-assessment and reflection. Self-assessments are key because the students, we need the students to take charge of their language acquisition. And we cannot expect that if we don't allow them to self-assess and actually give them credit for the way they self-assess. Peer feedback and peer feedback and peer review are very important because that lowers the affective filter. The students feel better when they talk to each other. When you tell them, okay, let's write this piece, and then you say, let's partner edit. Let's find a partner to edit. It's amazing how they work, and that also lowers your work filter. Let's just put it that way too. Okay, in the repertoire series, we have also rubrics for self-assessment that you can tweak a little bit for whatever you're doing in the classroom, but you have here kind of like the items that are important to take into account in a self-assessment. So again, I say these are things that I have not seen before in other programs that are very complete in the repertoire series. Okay, my friend. So formative assessment. Let's use formative assessments a lot, more than the summative ones. I know that the school wants us to fill that grade book with a bunch of grades, but the formative assessment, again, lowers the affective filter, and it's more helpful to our students because it's telling them where they can do better. Performance tasks. So designing performance-based tasks that require students to apply language skill in the real world scenarios, meaning that we're going to work with things that help someone, not just that we're imagining worlds and imagining situations, but we're going to do things with the language that help someone. For example, if you have a Hispanic community in your community, let's work with the Hispanic community. I used to work with a Hispanic community in a little town in Wisconsin. We created a newspaper in Spanish, and my students were in charge of writing articles and information that many of them were not very familiar with. For example, how to drive in the snow, things like that. So that's performance task. That's things that are real that we can use for better our communities or our environment. So the Reportero series also includes this kind of tasks, this kind of projects that are quite important in any language classroom. Also, the conversation analysis, let's analyze the students' conversations with them. How can we improve this conversation? How can we make it more meaningful, more interesting? What kind of words can we use? Like those words that I showed you at the beginning, see? What can we do in order to make this sound a little more natural? Because that's how people is gonna sound in the real country where they're gonna be traveling. And the portfolio assessment. Implement a portfolio assessment where students compile samples of their language work over time. And this is something that I have learned really well from the famous Profe Carmen Reyes, that she uses the portfolio assessment and she's always recording the students' work in order for them to see their progress at the end of the year. And something that is going to help you to connect with them and tell them, this is what you did at the beginning and look where you are. I like the way she does it, Profe Carmen Reyes, remember, because she puts everything in PowerPoints, in the slides. So it's easy access. It's not a bunch of papers. So keep in mind the portfolio assessment as well. Okay, my friends. So error analysis. Instead of correcting the students when they make a mistake, let's analyze the error and let's work with them on how, we can express ourselves better. Incorporating frequent checks for understanding is key. All the time, we're going to be looking at where are our students, what are they doing well. So that's why it's so important to apply strategies like quick quizzes. Quick quizzes are yes and no quizzes. Quick quizzes are this or that quizzes. Quick quizzes are true and false. Let's do a lot of true and false quizzes because the student gets, if it's written, the student gets to read and think if this is true or false. Quick quizzes are key and they help with frequent checks for understanding. And the exit ticket. It is very important to have exit tickets because that allows us to see what the students really got from the lesson. So sometimes we don't allow the time to do the exit ticket, something very short, it goes a long way. Okay, for example, here we have this example where we have a quick quiz presented here also in the Reportero series. Again, I like that these are kind of like quick quizzes that are not tests, that will overwhelm the students, but allows us or help us getting informed of where they are. Okay. Also, think, pair, share. Ask students to individually reflect on a question or prompt related to the lesson. Then discuss their thoughts with a partner before sharing them with the class. So let's think about what we're doing in the class. Let's allow them, hey guys, do you think this topic is really important or not? Because sometimes we don't ask those questions. We just assume that we have to teach the curriculum and someone really smart somewhere came up with the curriculum. That's what works. But sometimes we're off a lot. Concept mapping. Have students create concept maps or graphic organizers to visually represent their understanding or the connections between different ideas or topics covering the lesson. So concept mapping is important because we allow the students to look at the topics that we're learning in the class in a different way. And we talk about 1-minute papers. I like this strategy because we allocate a minute at the end of the lesson for students to write a brief summary of the main points they learned on any questions. I like to do this also at the beginning of the following class, 1-minute papers, where I ask them, okay, do you remember what we did last class? Do you remember the story about Carlos? What happened to Carlos? Please write really quickly, 1-minute paper to kind of like know where we are. The modest point. Ask students to identify the modest point or the concept they found most confusing during the lesson, allowing you to address any areas of misunderstanding. So they should have a paper where they write those things that they didn't get. And sometimes we go so fast and not even the student realizes what they didn't understand. But if they're conscious that there are parts that they didn't get, put that information on the modest paper, okay? So peer discussions, important, we talk about that. Think aloud are also important, analyzing what's going on in the class aloud. And also observation check-in, we talk about formative assessment, that's part of observation check-ins. Recall challenges, present a brief review of key concepts or vocabulary covered in previous lessons. Recall challenges is kind of like recycling, constantly recycling. But the thing with languages is that languages, they don't work the same way that recycling in the real world works. We talk about recycling because we're so overwhelmed trying to incorporate and teach new vocabulary every 2 or every 3 weeks that we leave behind what we did before. That's a sign that we're not doing the right thing. We should do less because less is more. And when you do less, you're always using the vocabulary that they are acquiring. And by using it is the only way they can actually say that they can acquire it. Prediction activities engage students in predicting outcomes or completing sentences based on context clues or prior knowledge. Application tasks assign short tasks or activities that require students to apply newly learned language skills or concepts in context. Very small tasks so they can show and they can apply. And my friend, don't forget the importance of incorporating frequent checks for understanding into teaching practice. Uh, that's key because that's what's going to help us discover where they are on their proficiency journey. So thank you so much for paying attention today to this webinar and this presentation.
Right now, we only have one question. Please, anyone, if you have any others, please feel free to send us an email and we will move it forward to Diego. And the other question we have is a teacher who was wondering how to see this in action, if there is any specific training that you might suggest or any specific techniques besides the one that we have seen, of course.
Yeah, I believe that Clear World Languages is working on organizing trainings for this type of topics because I understand that seeing it in theory on a webinar or through examples from the textbook is not the same as actually putting the teachers to work so they can experience it. So I will suggest this person to be in touch with Clear World Languages Marketing for future PD opportunities.
Schedule. Just thank you again, Diego, very much. It was
Thank
a
you.
very good presentation. We will be sure to, if there are any additional questions, we will move them forward to you. Thank you all and have an amazing rest of the evening.